Can you also talk a bit about the fact that your findings suggest that price and performance alone does not explain current adoption pattern? If cost and, let's say, raw benchmarks are not driving decision, what is driving decision? Is it the the bias or awareness, trust, governance, a throat to choke, perceived risk, misinterpretation, misunderstanding, vendor relationship, monopolies, or something else, or all of it?
All of the above. All of the above. Yeah, no, the way we think about that 24.8 billion dollars is that, economists, some of the assumptions we sometimes make are that everybody knows everything and is completely rational, right? And so, obviously that's not true in the real world, but if if the performance benchmarks were truly capturing everything we need to know about a model, and price was capturing, everything that was sort of reasonable about a model, then we would attribute that $25 billion to people just being irrational and just making decisions that don't make any sense, right? Now, that's not what we do. We don't say that that's the case. We say that there's these host of other reasons why it may make sense for people to adopt more expensive and less good, at least by the benchmarks, models. And so I think that, again, we in the paper, in like one of the final tables, we kind of split out those reasons into kind of valid reasons and perhaps like invalid reasons, right? And so the invalid ones are more these things about not understanding that your data doesn't become open or things like that. Whereas the valid ones are, again, these types of things like the ability to have somebody to call if something goes wrong and things like that, right? And I think that the other way to think about that too is that we can also think about that as potentially the switching costs, right? So again, the open models kind of came out a little bit later, and so if people were already invested in OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, whoever, then they may have just sort of stuck with that, and we may be picking up on some just switching costs, right? Like we know that it's more expensive and less efficient to be using the closed models that we're using, but it would be so expensive for us to swap to the open models that we're not going to do it, right? And the argument I would make there is don't only think about the switching costs today and what it would cost you to fork everything over and work on new models, but think about the long term, right? And really think about what happens if one of these closed source companies goes bankrupt and disappears tomorrow. Well, then you're going to be forced to transfer over to something else, and you won't have control over the timing or anything like that, right? And so thinking about the long-term impacts of what models you're choosing and how you're setting up your infrastructure around those models is something that when I talk to companies, I often emphasize as well.
When we look at these open ecosystems, they do create value over time, but it does take time. Can you talk about, if we just draw parallel to the Linux kernel, Kubernetes, and a lot of other open source projects, how do open models fit into that longer history of open source value creation over time? But we do need some players where folks look at it and don't look at, hey, it's just a project sitting on Hugging Face. It may disappear tomorrow, but actually there is an organization which is taking responsibility to ensure that these open models will continue to exist.
Yeah, so I think that's a great way to think about it. And I think the huge difference, of course, between what we talk about in terms of open LLMs, open AI models and things like that versus traditional open source is the whole notion of open weights, right? So there's something in the middle between closed and proprietary and fully open. And I think that's where the kind of this, banking on history is a little bit different, because take a model like Llama that's coming out of a company like Meta. It's a great model. It does lots of things very well, and it's open weight. But Meta is the only one developing it, right? So it's internally developed and then sort of opened, and the weights are open so people can use it freely and use it on their laptops or however they want to use it. And so that's a little bit different, because then you don't have the community kind of giving back to it and creating what we eventually, ended up with Linux and other lots of other open source projects. And so it's a little bit different from that perspective. Obviously, we do have some Gen AI that is true open source by the OSI definition, that the code is open. Of course, the weights are open, but also even the training data is open. And so I think that's something that we're going to continue to see a little bit of tension, a little bit of back and forth. Is what is the path for these, especially the open weight models that are not fully open source, but still play this super important role in their openness compared to the proprietary and pecuniary models. And I think that's where there may be a little bit of divergence from the past of open source software. All that said, I do think that we'll see, again, as people better understand what they actually need and they become more educated and knowledgeable about the technologies, I think we will see a similar kind of path that we saw in open source software, that, as people come to understand all those things, they start shifting to open more, at least for some context, right? And so, as you pointed out before, like Microsoft Azure is, running on top of Linux, right? Or like Windows installs today have like Linux, pieces of it baked into it, right? And so I think that that's probably the future where we're headed. But the question is kind of how long does it take us to get there, and exactly what does it look like on the other side in terms of where are the use cases that we end up seeing open being dominating, and where are the use cases that we end up seeing closed dominating, as we've come to see in operating systems, applications, everything else that we know and love about software.